Dr. Phil's hand shot up. "Hold on," he said, his voice cutting through the studio like a command no one expected. 200 people, audience members who had been settling into their seats, production assistants checking cables, camera operators adjusting angles, froze. And then, without a single cue from the producers, without any prompting from the teleprompters, they stood. All of them. At once. The applause started slow, then built into something that felt less like a response and more like a release. Tissues appeared in hands across the room. Shoulders shook. A woman in the third row covered her mouth, tears streaming freely. This wasn't scripted. This wasn't rehearsed. This was real. On stage, a mother and son stood inches apart, both trembling. Between them, on the small table that separated Dr. Phil's chair from theirs, lay a single white envelope. Worn at the edges. Opened. The letter inside was handwritten, the ink slightly smudged in places as if it had been read and reread countless times. Dr. Phil looked at the letter, then at the two people in front of him, then out at the standing audience. For a man who had spent decades navigating the most complex human emotions on national television, this moment had clearly caught him off guard. "I need to stop," he said quietly, almost to himself. Then louder, to the cameras. "Stop the tape." The red recording lights blinked off. The hum of the studio shifted. And in that brief, unscripted silence, something profound had just begun. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back. Back to 3 weeks earlier, when a message arrived at the Dr. Phil show that no one on the team could ignore. The email came in at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. Subject line: "I need help before it's too late." The message was short. A woman named Margaret, age 54, wrote that she hadn't spoken to her son in 12 years. Not because of abuse. Not because of addiction or betrayal in the traditional sense. But because of something quieter, something that had calcified over time into a silence so thick that neither of them knew how to break it. Her son Daniel was now 32. He lived 4 miles away from her. They had mutual friends. They shopped at the same grocery store. And yet, they had not exchanged a single word in over a decade. The incident that started it all? A misunderstanding at a family wedding. Words spoken in anger. Accusations made in front of relatives. And then, instead of reconciliation, a decision, by both of them, to simply stop trying. Margaret's email ended with a single line. "I'm afraid one of us will die before we ever speak again." The production team flagged it immediately. Dr. Phil read it the next morning. And within 48 hours, both Margaret and Daniel had agreed to come on the show. But there was a condition. Daniel insisted on one thing: no ambush. No surprise reveal. If his mother was going to be there, he wanted to know. He wanted time to prepare. He wanted to decide on his own terms whether he was ready. Dr. Phil agreed. This wasn't about television drama. This was about two people who had lost each other in plain sight. The taping was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon. Margaret arrived first, wearing a simple gray cardigan and clutching a small purse. Her hands shook as she sat down in the green room. A producer offered her water. She declined, then changed her mind, then held the cup without drinking. Daniel arrived 20 minutes later. He wore a button-down shirt, wrinkled at the sleeves, and jeans that looked like they'd been pulled from the closet that morning without much thought. His face was blank, but his jaw was tight. They didn't see each other before the show. Dr. Phil had been clear about that. This moment needed to happen on stage, where there was structure, where there was support, where he could guide them through it. The studio audience filed in. They knew they were about to witness something, but they didn't know what. The energy in the room was different from most tapings, quieter, more anticipatory, like everyone sensed they were about to be part of something fragile. Dr. Phil walked out to his usual applause, but he didn't smile the way he normally did. He didn't launch into his typical opening. Instead, he stood at center stage and spoke directly to the camera. "Today, we're going to talk about something that happens in families more often than anyone wants to admit. Not violence. Not screaming matches. Just silence. The kind of silence that starts small and then grows until it swallows everything. He gestured to the stage. Margaret is here today because she wants to break that silence. And her son Daniel is here because, after 12 years, he's finally ready to listen. Margaret walked out first. The applause was warm but subdued. She sat down in the chair across from Dr. Phil, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Then Daniel entered. The audience held its breath. He walked slowly, deliberately, his eyes fixed on the floor until he reached the chair next to his mother. He sat down without looking at her. For a long moment, no one spoke. Dr. Phil let the silence sit. He knew better than to rush it. "Margaret," he said finally, his voice softer than usual. "Tell me what happened." And she did. Slowly at first, then faster, the words tumbling out like they'd been waiting years to escape. She talked about the wedding. About the argument. About the things she'd said in anger that she wished she could take back. About the months that followed, when she kept waiting for Daniel to call, and he kept waiting for her to apologize, and neither of them ever did. "I thought," she said, her voice breaking, "that if I just gave him space he'd come back. But the space just kept getting bigger." Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Dr. Phil turned to Daniel. "What do you remember about that day?" Daniel's jaw worked for a moment before he spoke. "I remember feeling like I wasn't enough. Like no matter what I did, it was always going to be wrong. And I thought, if she can say those things to me in front of everyone, then maybe I'm better off just not being there." "So you left?" "Yeah. I left." "And you never came back?" Daniel shook his head. "No. I never came back." Dr. Phil leaned forward. "Do you love your mother?" The question hung in the air. Daniel's hands tightened on the armrests of his chair. His eyes stayed fixed on the floor. And then, barely audible, "Yes." Margaret's breath hitched. She pressed a hand to her mouth, tears spilling over. "Then why?" Dr. Phil said, his voice still gentle but firm. "Are you both choosing to live like this?" Either of them answered. Because the truth was, they didn't know. Somewhere along the way, the silence had become easier than the risk of reaching out. The distance had become safer than the vulnerability of trying again. Dr. Phil stood. He walked over to the small table between them and picked up the white envelope that had been placed there before the show. Inside was a letter. Margaret had written it the night before and given it to the producers that morning. She hadn't told Daniel about it. She wasn't sure if she'd have the courage to give it to him. He held the envelope in both hands, feeling its weight, not physical, but emotional. Everything this mother wanted to say, needed to say, was folded inside this single piece of paper. In his decades of hosting this show, Dr. Phil had read thousands of letters. Confessions. Apologies. Last attempts at connection. But something about this one felt different. Maybe it was the worn edges. Maybe it was the way Margaret's hands trembled when she handed it over that morning. Or maybe it was simply the knowledge that this letter represented 12 years of words left unspoken. Dr. Phil held the envelope but didn't open it immediately. "Margaret, you wrote something. Do you want to read it, or do you want me to?" Margaret shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "I can't. I'll break. Then I'll read it," Dr. Phil said. He opened the envelope carefully, unfolded the single sheet of paper inside, and began. "Dear Daniel, I have started this letter 1,000 times, and every time, I couldn't finish it. Because how do you say I'm sorry for 12 years of silence? How do you explain that the worst thing I ever did wasn't what I said at that wedding? It was what I didn't say every single day after. I didn't say I miss you. I didn't say I was wrong. I didn't say please come home. I told myself I was giving you space. But the truth is I was scared. Scared that if I reached out you'd reject me. Scared that you'd tell me it was too late. Scared that you'd confirm what I was already afraid of, that I had lost you for good. But I'm more scared now of losing you without ever trying. I'm more scared of the day when I won't have the chance to say this anymore. So I'm saying it now. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the words I said. I'm sorry for the years I stayed silent. I'm sorry for making you feel like you weren't enough, because you have always been more than enough. You have always been everything. I don't know if you can forgive me. I don't know if 12 years is too long. But I need you to know that I love you. I have loved you every single day, even the ones when I couldn't find the words to say it. I hope it's not too late. Love. Mom. Dr. Phil paused. The studio was so quiet that the hum of the overhead lights felt loud. He folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and handed it to Daniel. Daniel took it with both hands. He stared at it for a long time, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. And then, finally, he looked up. Not at Dr. Phil. At his mother. I thought, he said, his voice breaking, that you didn't want me anymore. Margaret shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I have always wanted you. Always. Daniel's face crumpled. And then, for the first time in 12 years, he reached for her. Margaret stood at the same moment he did. They met in the space between their chairs, and when they collided, it wasn't gentle. It was desperate. Daniel's arms wrapped around her like he was afraid she'd disappear if he let go. Margaret sobbed into his shoulder, her hands clutching the back of his shirt. Dr. Phil stepped back. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. And then, from somewhere in the audience, one person stood. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, all 200 people were on their feet, applauding, crying, witnessing something that felt less like television and more like grace. Dr. Phil looked out at them, then back at the mother and son still holding each other on stage. He raised his hand, not to stop them, but to pause everything else. Hold on, he said softly. The cameras kept rolling, but it didn't matter. Because in that moment, the show wasn't about ratings or segments or commercial breaks. It was about two people finding their way back to each other. And everyone in that room, everyone watching, understood that they were witnessing something sacred. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. After the taping, Dr. Phil sat with Margaret and Daniel in a private room off stage. The cameras were off. The audience had gone home. It was just the three of them and a box of tissues that was already half empty. What happens now? Daniel asked. Dr. Phil leaned back in his chair. That's up to you. But I'll tell you what I think. I think you've both been carrying this for 12 years, and it's been heavy. So now you put it down. You don't forget it, you can't, and you shouldn't, but you don't carry it anymore. Margaret nodded, her hands still holding Daniel's. I've arranged for you both to meet with a family therapist, Dr. Phil continued. Someone who can help you navigate what comes next. Because this moment today? This was the beginning. But the real work starts now. Daniel looked at his mother. Are you willing to do that? Yes, she said without hesitation. Whatever it takes. Dr. Phil stood, signaling that their time was coming to a close. But before he left, he turned back to them one more time. You know what I've learned in all my years doing this, he said. It's never too late. People think it is. They think time makes forgiveness impossible. But the truth is, it's never too late until it actually is. And you too? You made it. You're here. Don't waste it. Margaret and Daniel left the studio together that day. They didn't have all the answers. They didn't have a perfect plan. But they had something they hadn't had in 12 years, each other. The episode aired 3 weeks later. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of messages poured in from people who had been estranged from their own families. Some reached out to siblings they hadn't spoken to in decades. Others picked up the phone and called a parent they'd been avoiding. One woman wrote to say that she watched the episode with her daughter, and for the first time in 5 years, they cried together. Dr. Phil kept the letter. He didn't show it on camera again, but he kept it in his office, tucked into a folder labeled Moments That Matter. Because some stories aren't just about one family. They're about all of us. About the silence we carry. About the words we're too afraid to say. About the second chances we convince ourselves we don't deserve. Margaret and Daniel still see each other. They have dinner once a week. And sometimes, when the conversation gets hard, one of them will pause and say, "Remember that day?" The envelope still sits on Margaret's kitchen counter. A reminder that some words, once spoken, change everything. And some silences, once broken, can never be rebuilt.